Hi everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. There's so much to like about this book. The amazing world building, the characters. I think Roanhorse handles the multiple POVs really well. But I think the thing that stood out to me, one of the things that stood out to me the most was how gripping the first chapter was. And so today I want to talk about how Roanhorse accomplishes this and think through with you all what lessons we can take away from it and what we can apply to our own writing. So just to start off with a little summary here for those who haven't read the book or need a refresher, Black Sun is about the days and years leading up to a solar eclipse, which is a really important event in the society of the book, both for social, political, religious reasons. And because of that, of course, there's a lot of scheming and plans that go on around this event of the eclipse, which they call the convergence. One of the main characters is a man named Serapio, who is a crow god reborn into a person's body. And the first chapter follows him on a day 10 years before the convergence when he's still a young boy, about 12 years old, I think. So let's look at why this first chapter is so outstanding. So the first thing I think that Roanhorse does really well is she sets up one of the main themes of the book, which is fate versus free will. And importantly, this is also a very universal theme. So the fact that it's a universal idea, universal theme is really crucial because it doesn't require the reader to have any sort of inside knowledge or deep understanding of the particular characters or world or situation of the book. They can sort of get into it right away, and this is a perennially interesting question that just people, humanity, society is interested in almost naturally. So the author brings in this theme in the very first line, and I think this first line is compelling not only because of the universal nature of this theme, as I just talked about, but also because it ties that universality with a very specific context within the setting of the book. So readers get that initial universal, interesting, just larger idea, but also start to build in the specifics of the book and the characters that they'll become really invested in later. So let's look at a quote here. The first line, "Today he will become a god. His mother had told him so." So just on a surface level, of course, this is really intriguing. We have a character here. We assume he's human, but we're told he's going to become a god. So we're immediately wondering, like, how is that going to happen? We're immediately, as readers, pulled into the story. But then there's also this really fascinating power dynamic because we think of gods as being all-powerful, and yet here this character's fate is being decided by his mother. And to add on to that power dynamic, even his identity is erased to a certain extent because he's just known as he at this point, and we don't even learn what his name is until his mother herself says it. So throughout the course of the book, this idea of Serapio being almost a vessel for the god comes up again and again, and of course that brings up a lot of interesting questions, like what that means for him, whether he's allowed to wish for a fate outside of what the fate that's been assigned to him, and so on and so forth. And this is all set up beautifully in the very first line, and throughout the rest of this first chapter as well, we begin to explore these ideas that will come up again and again throughout the book. So not only does Roanhorse set up one of the really important themes here, but she also sets up a compelling emotional arc for Serapio that again will be explored throughout the book. He's one of the main characters, and so of course it's really important that we get invested in him right away. And I think specifically in a question that haunts him throughout the course of the book, which is that he never really knows whether other characters, other people are invested in him and care about him for his own sake, or whether they're more almost exploiting him or using him for their own means. So basically, understandably, he has a really hard time trusting other people, but then later in the book, he does meet somebody who can trust, and their relationship becomes a really compelling and ultimately, I think, heartbreaking part of the story. So just a quick warning here, this will be a little bit spoilery, but it is all revealed in the first chapter of the book, so you will get past the spoilers soon if there are any. So anyway, the way that Roanhorse portrays Serapio's mother, who I think stereotypically is at the base of a lot of these issues that he has later on, these questions that he grapples with, the way that Roanhorse portrays her is really multi-layered. It makes readers think deeply about her, which then leads into these questions of love and trust that recur throughout the book. So on the one hand, from Serapio's perspective, she's fully in the right. So he thinks that he was okay, that the crow god's will must be followed, that he wanted this, that his mother would never hurt him. And then slightly before that, he thinks her dark eyes brimmed with a love that warmed him from head to toe. So he perceives his mother as loving him very deeply. And because we as readers have already started to become invested in Serapio as a character, we sort of feel that. But on the other hand, we also see some pretty horrible things that she does to him. So she, sews his eyes shut, she carves patterns into his flesh, and she basically condemns him to a really, really difficult and painful life before he ultimately fulfills the purpose that's been laid out for him in the prophecy. Essentially, she turns him into a vessel and takes away his humanity in a way, as we were just talking about, takes away his identity. But on the other hand, there is an element of tradition and history here, which makes us think even more closely about this issue in a different perspective. So Roanhorse writes, his mother's people carved their flesh as a symbol of their perpetual mourning for what was lost. And so this complicates things, again, because, later on in the book, we're going to find out more about the backstory and history and what happened there. So readers basically see this from all sides, even within the first chapter, and this sets up the emotional arc and emotional struggle later in the book really well. When Serapio, 10 years down the line, really struggles to find people who he can trust, find people who love him, and who don't just want to use him or don't feel obligated to help him or care about him. So the third thing that Roanhorse does really spectacularly just within this first chapter to make it a really gripping chapter is that she establishes some really striking elements of the world building. So one of those is, of course, the sewing shut of the eyes and carving of the flesh. But this also comes along with some really enticing cultural hints. So the idea of that perpetual mourning for what was lost that I mentioned in a quote a second ago, the hints that there's this sort of conflict or animosity between cultures in this society. So for example, Serapio is used to the teasing from other children that he looked not enough this or too much that. He had always understood that his mother was the foreigner here. So this sets up a world with these conflicts not unlike our own world, but also very specific and manifesting themselves in very interesting and very concrete, visible ways that the reader can immediately grasp onto. Then another element of the world building here is the sort of magical and religious elements. For instance, the bag of powder that Serapio's mother wears before giving it to him. Roanhorse says that it holds secret things, and Serapio's mother warns him, use it only when you need it. So we know that it's going to be important and that it's connected to Serapio's destiny somehow, but we're left with a lot of curiosity as to what exactly it is, what it does, and how it's going to connect to the prophecy and Serapio's fate. And then, of course, the other religious element here is the eclipse. And this is interestingly seen as the crow god swallowing the sun. So even there we have a very interesting, very different conception of this astronomical event than what we would obviously think of in modern times. And of course, eclipses and other astronomical events were, in ancient societies, were seen as really powerful omens and really were the subject of a lot of stories and theories and were thought to just hold a lot of power in general. And so it's fascinating to see how that manifests itself within the fantastical culture of this book. And of course, this is another thing that we know is going to be really important throughout the story because of the way that the structure and the timeline is set up. Everything is framed in terms of time until the convergence. So this is 10 years until the convergence. There's a lot that are, 20 days until the convergence, the day of the convergence. All of this is set up around this event. So we know it's going to be really crucial, and we start to get hints of it and how society perceives it and its import just within this first chapter, which I think is a really amazing way of setting up this book. And then finally, one last thing that makes this chapter really gripping is that it starts with almost a gruesome scene that I think attracts readers' morbid curiosity. So I did touch on this a little bit before, but I want to go into it in more depth because I think that this strategy is something that writers often turn to but don't always get it right. So I think a lot of writers think that something dramatic, something bloody, some action adventure type of scene or whatever is the key to grabbing readers' attention in the first chapter. But I think there is actually a balance here that can be quite hard to strike. I will admit I was really drawn in a morbid kind of way when I read about Serapio's mother sewing his eyes shut. I really wanted to know why she was doing this, what effect it was going to have, and I was also drawn in by the way that Roanhorse builds builds up the tension leading to this moment. So for example, showing us the table where she says there are these ropes that his mother is going to use to bind him. There's other tools that she's going to use on him, but the author doesn't immediately tell us what she's going to do. So of course it creates this almost horror-like suspense there. That really kept me reading. But I don't think I would have been that engaged if it was just violence for the sake of violence, just gratuitous blood and gore. And instead, Roanhorse starts to lay out the cultural and historical context like we talked about before. So Roanhorse, of course she has to describe the pain and the blood to some extent, but it's definitely not the main focus of the chapter, and instead she focuses in on sort of the surrounding elements, not just culture, but also things like Serapio's confusion and fear, his doubt, the moment when his mother whispers his true name to him, or the way that he plunges into this new world that his mother has sort of pushed him into by doing this procedure on him. And by the last line of the chapter, his world has changed completely. His life is overturned. And with this line, Roanhorse ends the chapter, his mother was gone. So his eyes are sewn shut, his mother is gone, his life has changed forever. And that's really the focus of the chapter, instead of the blood and gore and pain of these very gruesome things that she's doing to him. So I think maybe my curiosity was piqued by this violence and the unusual nature of it, but my attention was held by everything that's around it that made it meaningful instead of just being a spectacle. So for me, these four things made me really enjoy this first chapter, get drawn in by this first chapter, and set me up really well to enjoy the rest of the book. So she sets up some of the main themes, as well as the emotional arcs and emotional struggle of one of the main characters. She sets up a lot of the world building, unique and interesting elements of culture and society and history in this world. And she packages it all in this chapter that has just the right balance of gruesomeness so that readers are drawn in but not turned off by the level of blood and gore in a book that's not really supposed to be about that. I would love to hear from you if you have thoughts about this, whether about the first chapter, about the book overall. I really loved it, so I would love to chat with you all about it in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a great time making it and thinking about Black Sun. If you did like it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe and hit the bell. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.